Greetings, citizens. Hey you beautiful, creepy human being you. Welcome to my channel and welcome to today's true crime video. I'm so happy we could meet like this. I'm so happy that somehow in all of this that we're forced to deal with on the day-to-day, today you and I were able to find each other on this crazy little planet that we call home. My name is Brittany or Bratterstein, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be discussing the murder of Mandy Stavik. Mandy was an 18-year-old girl who was brutally murdered while visiting home during Thanksgiving break in 1989. And despite authorities' best efforts to solve this case, it went unsolved for decades and actually just recently got resolution in 2019 in a very interesting way. But before we get started, if you have not yet had the pleasure, please make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new video every single week and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you specifically you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. One of us. Now, this is a wild case, dude. This is a case that when I was looking into it, it really made me kind of go through it emotionally. I was upset. I was angry. I was sad. It's scary. It's the type of case where the victim, Mandy, was doing something that any person does on any given day, right? She was just going on a neighborhood run. Well, maybe not any person, because you're not going to catch me running unless somebody's chasing me, but you know what I mean. She was just snatched up while doing something that she had done 1,000 times before without having any worry in her mind. You know what I mean? And then for something this horrible to happen to her and then it to go unsolved for so long. No one knew who did this to her for such a long time. And this is so very much one of those cases of if you see something, if you know something, say something, because that is how this case got solved after all of these years. So today I'm going to tell you that entire story. I read all the things so that you do not have to. And at the end of this video, I want you to answer the question of the day. I'm going to give it to you now so you can have it kicking around in your brain while we go through all of the details of this case. Obviously, I want you to answer it like once you have the information, but I'm going to give it to you now. And the question of the day is this. What do you believe was the motive for the murder of Mandy Stavik? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below after we go through all the details of this case. Now, with all of that said, come gather around and let me tell you the story of the murder of Mandy Stavik. Now, I want to start this video off with a quote. This is a quote from the Reverend who actually spoke at Mandy's funeral. He said to the crowd of Mandy, quote, "Whoever did this didn't just rob this beautiful young girl of her life. They robbed us all." Now, our story begins during the Thanksgiving holiday in 1989. It was Friday the 24th, the day after Le Feast, some might say. An 18-year-old Mandy Stavik, who was home visiting from college, was lacing up her light blue running shoes and leashing up her old pup, Kyra. Kyra was a 6-year-old German Shepherd, and the two were going to go on a run that Mandy had gone on like 1,000 times because she lived there for a very long time, like her whole life, mostly. Well, not her whole life. She lived in the area for a long time before going off to college. This is something she did many, many times. She would run from her home on Strand Street to the Nooksack River and then turn around and run back. That's what her and Kyra would do. So Mandy and Kyra left the house at about 2:30 p.m. and then time ticked on. It ticked on and it ticked on. And after a little bit of time, Mandy's mom started to get worried because, as I said, this was a very routine run for Mandy. She had done it a bunch of times, and Mandy was a very routine and scheduled girl. So her mom knew how long this run generally took. And the fact that she wasn't back yet was starting to make her a bit worried. Then her mother's anxiety raised a little bit more when Mandy's brother, Lee, the son of family, sure, Lee comes home and he was like, that's weird that Mandy's not here yet because I was outside of my friend's house and I saw Mandy running back towards the house. So she definitely should have been back by now. So that's just not good. Then for the cherry on top of this up cake, Kyra. Kyra comes back to the house alone. She's terrified. She's shaking. She's got her tail between her legs and she's cowering. Her hindquarters are covered in what was called river silt. And I didn't know what that was. So I looked it up and it's described as kind of like minerals. It's like a specific type of mineral and it just kind of looks like mud. So she's wet. Her butt's all muddy. She looks terrified and she's totally alone. So where was Mandy? But first, who was Mandy? Amanda Teresa Stavik, who went by Mandy, was born April 16th, 1971. And she was one of 4 children born to her mother, Mary. She had an older brother named Brent, an older sister named Molly, and a younger brother named Lee. And her dad, I believe his name was Glenn, but I hardly saw any reports on him because he and Mary divorced when Mandy was pretty young, and then her family moved away. They had previously lived in Alaska, actually, but moved to Washington when Mandy was in junior high. And when Mary came over, she came with her kids, but not with Glenn, as far as I've seen. So Mandy and her family, they came over to Washington. That's where they decided to set down roots, plant roots, be trees. They decided to come to Washington, and they moved into a super small community where Mandy's mom, Mary, got a job as a bus driver. And when I say a super small community, I mean, okay, for example, in 2020, so years after the events that we're talking about right now, years later, when there should be more people there, the population was only 120 people. So it's quite very small. This was a rural village in Whatcom County, the most northwest county in Washington, actually. And it was about 15 minutes away from Bellingham, where there isn't much. Like this place that they were living at, there wasn't much. There was just a general store, a post office, a gas station, a diner, an elementary school, and 2 churches. So when you say like everyone knows everyone, you know, everyone knew everyone here. Or if you didn't know them, you'd see them. You'd be like, oh, I've seen that person because there's one store and we both shop there. The majority of people who had lived in this area had lived there for generations, like my grandma and your grandma, and they would hang out together by the fire, like that kind of vibe. They had a thing that I feel like a lot of us just don't have anymore. It's like a world that doesn't exist, you know, that missing and longing for a place that's just not real anymore. And that is like a real sense of community. This was a place where people knew each other. They knew each other's movements. And most importantly, they like really watched out for each other. Nobody's watching out for anybody where I live, and I've never lived in a place where anyone did. People ate at the same diner. They got their necessities at the same general store. They felt safe, you know what I mean? They didn't lock their doors. They left their keys in the ignition. There was lots of like farms and cows. It was just like a quaint, cute place. But anyways, Mandy. Mandy was an exceptional person. She was said to be fearless. Even as a child, when she was about 2 years old, her mother had like, this is so cute, but she had borrowed some bulls, like male cows, right, that belonged to her neighbors so that they could like eat the growth that was on her property. So she's like, hey, you got some extra bulls I can borrow because like I need some grass eaten up over here. And at this time, Mandy, as I said, was like 2, so she was super small. And I guess she had gotten out the front door and she was small enough that she could just like walk under the gate where these bulls were. So she marches her little 2-year-old butt up to these bulls. They freeze in fear. They're scared of her. She wasn't scared of them. These giant bulls, she's not scared. She wants to play. Okay, obviously her mom sees her, comes out, scoops her up. She's terrified of what could have happened, but Mandy was fearless. She wasn't scared at all. Mandy's mother said that Mandy was everything. She couldn't think of any other word to describe her. She even said like she wasn't sure how she was able to have Mandy as a child because she, Mary, considered herself to be such an ordinary person, and Mandy was extraordinary. Everyone liked her. She was that girl. Like, okay, she was the type of girl who would help arrange groups to help encourage the other students to take part in blood drives and food drives, you know, like she cared about other people. She was special. Her mother doesn't know how she ended up being so special, but she was. And her mother said of her, quote, she's one of these people who wants to leave the world a better place. The world needs people like her. She was bright. She was intelligent. She was vivacious. She was personal. She was the type of person that was always smiling. And you can see in photos of her, every single photo, she's cheesing big time. And you know when you can tell by a person's smile that they are a good person? Well, look at her. You've seen her. You can clearly see the type of person she was just in the way her face lights up. She was athletic. She liked riding horses bareback, running across fields, playing softball, basketball, baseball, track, cheerleading. She also played music. She played the flute, the clarinet, and the saxophone in the school band. She was an honors student who spoke Japanese and was fluent in sign language. She did like everything. Like she was such an overachiever that when her mom found out she was going to try to take basketball and track at the same time, which is like, who has the lung capacity for that much movement? Not I. Said the cow, quite frankly. But anyways, when her mom found out she was going to do that, she was like, you know, it's going to be kind of hard for you. I don't think you're going to be able to do both of these things at the same time. And Mandy was like, you want to bet? And her mom was like, actually, no, I don't, because you never bet against Mandy about anything because you would lose. One of Mandy's teachers said of her, quote, she was a high achiever. She wanted to do well in everything she did. She had it all going for her. She had a bright future ahead of her. She was just the type of girl who like really stood out. You know what I mean? She did everything. And in addition to doing everything, she tried to do it well. She tried to do it the best that she could instead of trying to just like I'm sufficient in a lot of things. No, I am the best at a lot of things. And her sister even said, like, she accomplished so much with the short time she was given on this planet. And this part, oh my God, this will kill you. I don't know if it killed me. But when Mandy was still missing before her body had been found, her mother like put out a plea to the public and a plea to whoever had her daughter, saying, quote, "Whoever's got her, don't hurt her. We need her back. She's got things to do." At the time she was killed, she had a boyfriend named Rick, and he said what he loved most about her was that she was so independent. The two had met in high school when he was a sophomore and she was a freshman. And he said that for some reason she loved him, even though he knew in his heart that she was like way out of his league. They were each other's like first big love. They had dated for 3 years. And of course they had broken up a couple of times. They were in high school and they were still together though. You know what I mean? And he did seem like he loved her. Like when you watch interviews with him years later, he still, after all that time, seems like truly affected by what happened to Mandy. At the time of her murder, she was 18 years old. She had recently graduated from Mount Baker High School, which was like the high school where every single person in the story went. You'll see if I mention it. I can't remember if I mention it or if I will mention it, like in my notes. I've got it in my brain. But like most of the people we're going to talk about in this case went to Mount Baker High School. So she had just graduated from there, and she was in her first year at Central Washington University, and she was just home for the Thanksgiving break to have a little break from school before going back and getting on with her life when she was snatched from the street and snatched from this world. She had just gotten home from college like a day or two before. She had spent some time with friends and then, had the big Thanksgiving feast on the Thursday, had the big dinner or lunch or, it's 1 p.m. when we do be eating Thanksgiving. I don't know about your family, but it's 1 p.m. when I do be eating Thanksgiving dinner, which really is like Thanksgiving lunch that you eat from 1 p.m. until you go to bed that night, just periodically munching. And then the next day was Friday, and she laced up and grabbed Kyra and went out for her run like normal. And it's actually so sad because Mary would normally go on this run with Mandy. Like before Mandy went off to school, her and Mary would do this run together. Mandy would get on the bike. Mary would drive, actually. No. Back up. Mary would get on her bike. Mandy would take Kyra and she'd go off running. Mary would follow on the bike. The dog would do her best to try to keep up. But during this time, Mary's sister was visiting because it was the holiday. So she didn't go with Mandy because she wanted to stay and visit with her sister. And she had like a ton of guilt about the fact that she wasn't with her that day. But anyways, back to that day. Mandy out on her run. Her brother Lee is at his friend's house. He sees Mandy run by going towards the river like she would go on a run. Then he sees her turn around. Well, he didn't see her turn around, but he sees her running back in the direction of the house. So presumably she's going home. After some time, he leaves his friend's house. He goes home. He gets there and he's like, that's weird. Mandy should be here by now. I saw her coming home. Like, where is she? So immediately Lee and Mary go out and look for her. When they can't find her, they come back to the house and just sort of wait. Like, what else are they going to do at this time? They can't immediately think that something's wrong. But Mary said of this time, quote, "I was panicked. She was so consistent in what she always did. There was no reason for her not to come back." And then I can't even imagine the panic that her mother felt when Kyra came back without her. This case reminds me so much of the Christina Williams case, because that was the case where the 13-year-old girl had went off and walked her dog on the military base in California, and then the dog came back without her and she was just gone. And that's also another case that went cold for like a super long time and recently got resolution too, now that I think about it. So they really do have a lot of similarities. It's probably why it's popping into my head. But anyway, Mary freaked out reasonably and she started calling everybody. She called her friends. She called her boyfriend, seeing if anybody had seen her, and nobody had seen her and nobody had heard from her. So almost immediately, with Mandy being presumed abducted, like they were like, okay, she's not missing, she was taken. That's almost immediately, that's the response she got. She got the type of response that everybody who goes missing deserves to get. You know what I mean? We see so often when that doesn't happen, but they knew. They were like, let's go. So a massive hunt for her began, and this hunt was led by a man named, like an officer named Ron Peterson, and they were using like every possible way to try to locate her. There were people on horses. There were helicopters in the sky. There were people on foot going door to door. There were jeeps. Every way that you could get across the terrain to try to look for her or in the sky, you know what I mean? they were doing. And in the meantime, Mary was calling anyone and everyone she could think of to come out and help in the search so they could get as many feet on the ground as humanly possible. They knew right away that her being gone was an issue, like something had to be wrong. She wasn't the type of girl to run away or anything like that. She even had plans with friends for that evening, plans that she wouldn't miss. She wasn't just going to bail on people. That wasn't her way. There was nothing in her history to suggest that something like that would be the case. But her mom in the beginning said she didn't want to believe that Mandy could be gone. I think she basically was feeling like lightning couldn't strike the same place twice. And she ended up calling Mandy's older sister, Molly, and told her that Mandy was missing. And her sister echoed that lightning strike twice sentiment when she was like, this cannot be happening to us again. And I say that because, and they said that because their family had already experienced a very similar tragedy. This is just like so insane and so tragic. I cannot believe it. Like when I think about this, I feel so bad for Mandy's family. But basically, you remember how I said Mandy had an older sister named Molly, a younger brother named Lee, and an older brother named Brent. Well, Brent had tragically died years before. He had actually been killed in Alaska before the family had moved to Washington. So basically what happened is Brent had gotten permission to hunt on a military base called Fort Richardson. This was in Anchorage. He got permission to hunt on this military base, and he was killed while doing so. And I read that he was just 16 years old. After Brent was killed, Mary received a call from the military to let her know that this had happened. And apparently what happened here is her son was shot 17 times in the head and chest. And I don't think they ever figured out who did this. Like Mary in an interview said, she doesn't even have any idea the name of the person responsible. And I went on the internet and I scoured it, and it looks like it's still unsolved to this day. 17 times. Okay, that's not an accident when you shoot somebody 17 times. So for her to have her son murdered in such a horrible way, and for that to be unsolved, and then to have her daughter, her teenage daughter, go missing, I cannot even imagine what she was feeling. I truly cannot. Oh, and speaking of tragedy, before I forget, one more thing, which is just like, there isn't a lot. There's this is probably going to be the only other thing I say about Mandy's father, Glenn, in this case, but it's something that was mentioned, and it's probably just because, again, this family's gone through so much. Apparently, Glenn, his stepson, so he divorces Mary, he gets remarried. He has a stepson. I believe he was 20 years old. His stepson drowned in a boating accident in 1988. So this family is just surrounded by a cloud of just sad death. And it's horrible. How does one group endure so much and come out? I do not understand. They did have a lot of support, though. I guess that could be part of it. At least Mary did. I don't know about Glenn, but Mary definitely did. Everyone was out there looking for Mandy, checking on the side of the road and through all the acres and acres of land nearby. And they were hoping and praying that she'd be found alive. There were jars on counters of businesses in the area so that people could donate money towards the search and rescue efforts, and posters of her everywhere saying that she was missing and giving a description for people to be on the lookout for. She was said to have been wearing a light-colored sweatshirt, dark green sweatpants, light blue running shoes with a purple stripe, a gold watch, silver hoop earrings, and she had her Walkman with her because she loved to listen to music when she ran. She was 5'8". She was about 130 pounds. She had light brownish, blonde, curly, shoulder-length hair and brown eyes. Now, 2 days after Mandy went missing, the first piece of evidence was found that they thought could lead them, or basically the first thing was found that gave them any sort of direction because they really weren't finding anything. And this was when in an overgrown area, they found a pair of teal sweatpants. And you remember, Mandy was said to have been leaving in a pair of dark green sweatpants. So these pants stood out because the area where they were found, it was really waterlogged. Everything was wet. It was really overgrown. And the pants stood out because they didn't seem like they had been there that long. They weren't as wet as the surrounding areas. So they were taken as potential evidence. But when Mandy's mom looked at them, she didn't believe that they belonged to her daughter. The pants were like dirty and they had holes ripped in them. And she said that like her daughter just simply would not wear something that was in that condition. I mean, I can see why police were looking into it though, because like they were outside. She could have gone through something. There could be a reason that they were ripped and dirty. So they looked into them and they were able to retrieve fibers from them. And they actually were able to retrieve semen from them. And they were sent to like the lab to be processed. And it was determined that these were not related at all to Mandy's disappearance. It took 3 days from the time that Mandy went missing for her to be found. And she wasn't found in a way that anybody would want, obviously, or we wouldn't be talking about it today. Basically what happened is, remember Ron Peterson, I told you he was the detective like leading the search. Well, him and a team were in a boat and they were going down the river, searching the river. And they came to an area with a bend and they like went off the main river and down a side channel in their boat, when all of a sudden he saw something like in the distance in the water. And what he was seeing was Mandy. Mandy was found floating in the Nooksack River, and she was found a couple of miles away from her home. And what Ron was seeing when he looked out in the water was her socks and her tennis shoes, because that's actually all she was wearing at the time she was found. She was like on her stomach and her body had gotten sort of like caught in debris, and that's what stopped her from continuing to float downriver. The area that she was in was sort of like shallow, right? It was shallow. So Ron got out of the boat and he like retrieved her body and he flipped her over. And he said when he saw her face, it like really stunned him because of how much she looked like his daughter. He said he had a daughter about the same age. She had very similar characteristics. So when he looked at her, it was like very jarring for him. And he just like held her and was like, I got you now. Like, I got you. I'm going to get you out of here. And this like really affected him and stuck with him. Even years later in interviews, when he talks about this, you can tell like he's near tears even after all of this time. And what's so eerie and so sad is that like, even though she had been in the water for 3 days, she didn't really, like she hadn't started to decompose. She didn't look all that different because the water had been so cold that it had like preserved her. So when they were looking at her in the water, she looked like you could just shake her awake. She looked like she was just asleep. So Ron's partner then had to go and deliver the news to Mandy's family that she had been found. And her mother said that she was shocked to learn she was dead, but that she knew that deep inside, she knew, she felt that her daughter was gone. She said she had felt it like the whole time. And that she didn't want to admit it, not even to herself. But that's why when she found out, she was just kind of like, well, obviously she had a stronger reaction than that. But like she knew that it was coming. And at the time that she found out, Mandy's boyfriend, Rick, was actually at the house and he had been upstairs, I believe, and he was watching through the window and he watched Mary get the news. And at that time, he just knew as well that Mandy was gone. And then when Mary came inside and she confirmed to him what he had already believed, they just like fell apart. And then when Molly, Mandy's older sister, found out about it, she lost it. She like started screaming. She ran outside and just started like screaming at the sky, at the world, and God, like, how could you let something like this happen to her? How can you do this to my family again? Mary has said that this is the type of thing that she wouldn't wish on her worst enemy, that this feeling is the worst thing you could possibly feel. Like there is nothing worse than losing a child. And she already knew this feeling. And now she had lost 2 of her kids. The medical examiner performed Mandy's autopsy the next day, and it was determined that her cause of death was actually drowning. And that was weird because Mandy was like a very strong swimmer. She was even a lifeguard at one point. Like she could swim. And it was clear that she hadn't done this to herself, though. Like you could tell, one, the condition she was found in, she was nude in the water with just her shoes and her socks. It was determined she had drowned, but she also had blunt force trauma to the top of her head. It wasn't enough to have killed her, but it definitely could have knocked her out. And on top of that, it was determined that she had been sexually assaulted. Now, at this time, DNA hadn't really been used. Like, it wasn't being used to solve cases prior to about this time. I believe the first time it happened was in, like, 1986 in the UK. So we're right around that time, but not quite. But because Ron, the detective, had just recently gone and did this whole class with the FBI learning all about DNA, he knew that the time was now. Like this was the time when he wanted to be very careful about saving things like this, because now we might actually be able to use any DNA taken from Mandy, from the scene, all that, to solve this case. So They needed to preserve it, and then they needed to keep it so that they could investigate, find somebody to test it against, and hopefully find the person responsible for doing this. But that was going to be the part that was going to be difficult and take like a lot of time. People were shocked. They were crying. They were scared. They were feeling so many things when it came to this happening to Mandy. Not only the grief of losing her, but also the fear that like a very brutal, violent murderer was still out there, and they didn't know if he was going to strike again. The entire community was affected by this. This was the kind of thing that changed this place forever. It took a sense of innocence away from them. They were like, I could see this happening in a big city, LA, New York, Seattle even, but not here. This was the type of place that people moved to for the safety, the community, the quiet, and the peace. They came here for like a slower pace at life and to just be able to do things without having to always be worried. And now they couldn't do that. Were people going to go out just jogging? Were girls just going to go out jogging now? No, that part of their lives was just gone. And everywhere people looked, they were worried they were seeing the person who had killed Mandy. And everywhere people were looking, they were just seeing danger. The local store and other stores in the area started stocking up on mace. People started actually locking their front door, which they hadn't done before. And like a new self-defense class popped up that people could take, and it was called self-defense for gentle people. Like they were trying to do all kinds of things to protect themselves. And even Mary, Mandy's mom, was like, this is the type of kook that will strike again. Like somebody's not going to do something like this and this be like the only thing they've ever done or ever will go on to do. This is what she's thinking in her mind. This is what most people would think in their mind. And it's so sad, dude, because Mary, she came out after this and was like, listen, I don't want to let my 2 remaining children go anywhere now. Like Lee and Molly, she's like, no, you're not going anywhere. And I totally get that, dude. To have 2 of your kids murdered, I couldn't deal with it, dude. I wouldn't. I don't even have words. I'm not even going to even try to have words for that. But I can understand why she felt the way she felt. And she said that like the local parents in her neighborhood, they like banded together to start sort of like a crime watch thing so that they could watch for each other, like a neighborhood watch, but like for more serious crimes. And they were teaching their children, who previously they didn't have to teach this kind of stuff, what they needed to do to protect and defend themselves. And what's super crazy is this fear and like uncertainty didn't stay contained to Mandy's hometown. It spread even where she went to school, to the college, the university where she was. It had spread there. People were scared there. Dorm rooms started having their locks changed. They had a memorial service for Mandy, and like the kids there, the youths, the college students were for the first time really for most of them. Obviously some people had experienced tragedy before because that's how life goes, but this was like showing them how fragile life really is even at such a young age. It's something like that happening at that sort of age between like 14 to 20. I mean, I can't really say that. This is personal experience. It's very eye-opening to have something very violent happen to somebody you know when you're in a formidable age, especially when you're at that age where you feel invincible, untouchable. Nothing can happen. You know it can, but it's not going to happen to you. And then it happens to somebody close to you, somebody you knew well, or somebody that you just knew in passing, and it changes you. It just is. This was also a very publicized case. Every TV station, radio station, newspaper, they were all covering Mandy's story. Even outside her state, people all over were affected by Mandy's murder. Like Mandy's mom got letters from all over the place. People all over the country that had never met Mandy but were still affected by what happened to her. Everyone saw somebody they knew in Mandy, their own friends, sisters, daughters. It was like her basketball coach said, Mandy's legacy was one of love. Nearly 1,000 people attended Mandy's memorial service. It was so large that there weren't any churches within miles that could house so many people. So her memorial service ended up taking place at her like old school auditorium. And this was so intense for her mother because she knew her daughter was special, but she didn't realize just how many people Mandy had touched throughout her years on this earth. And she said it was really hard for her because like so much of her wanted to preserve Mandy and keep her just for herself, keep her memory just for herself. But in losing her, she had to kind of share her with the world. Mandy's basketball coach did a eulogy at her funeral. Is there one eulogy? My brain is not remembering how funerals work. It's been quite some time, thankfully. But I know there was a reverend, but also her basketball coach did a or the eulogy because they were apparently very close. Like, it was more than just a mentoring through sports type situation. Like, after, her mom and her dad got divorced, this guy was like a father figure to her. And she had even written him like a card at one point saying that he was like the most inspirational and influential person like in her life. So they were very, very close. Her uncle also spoke to the audience. He was the person who spoke like for her family. He was their spokesperson. And he said to the audience for her family, quote, "When we felt fear and anger, you gave us love. When we felt grief, you grieved too. Here in the depths of mourning, we can feel healing begin." A song was written for Mandy that was performed at her funeral, and it was called Mandy Song. And in it, there was a line that said, quote, "In our hearts, you will always be a very special memory, Mandy," end quote. And the song was performed at the funeral by some of her friends, and it was super emotional. The whole thing was emotional. Poinsettia plants were lined around the track where Mandy used to run for her, track. She was in track. So around the track that she would run, there were poinsettia plants, and there were TV news stations there. Like, this was definitely a more public situation. But then after the memorial service, there was a private graveside burial at St. Joseph Mission Cemetery, just for those that were closest to her. About 24 of Mandy's family members and friends were present at the private graveside burial, and she was cremated. So it was her ashes that were buried. And this cemetery was super close to her mom's house. I think it was just like a half a mile, so she would easily be able to visit. And the reverend said, there's a part of us that never dies. Like, during her funeral, that's what he said. And I guess, that's the part that her mother gets the opportunity to visit. During the graveside funeral, her boyfriend, Rick, was one of the people that were there. And he was there holding a teddy bear that belonged to Mandy. And you can see a photo of this. I found a clip from newspapers.com where you can see him. In the article, it says like a friend was standing there with Mandy's teddy bear, but it was Rick. And it's so sad. Like, it destroyed my heart. He said that he had to, like, after she was killed, he went back to college and he like retrieved some of her things. And one of those things was that teddy bear. And he said that it like smelled like her. And then he broke down. Oh God, see, it's going to get me again. And then he broke down in that moment saying that like the smell had faded. And that, like, I don't know what it was about that. It just messed me up a little bit. After Mandy was killed in late December, so, about a month after Mandy was killed, 40 people met at Mary's house, and they got together because they were planning to do like a demonstration, essentially. They said they wanted to get together and stand against fear. So basically, they all got together and they were going to hold hands and they were going to march down Strand Street. They were going to take the walk that Mandy would have ran, right? Do you understand what I'm saying? I don't know why the sentence isn't coming out good. Probably because I don't sleep, because I have a baby that doesn't sleep. But you know what I mean. They held hands and they walked down this stretch of road, which is where Mandy had ran, because they were saying that they didn't want fear to control and dictate their lives. They said that their love was stronger than the fear that they were all feeling. They wanted to make the choice to not live in fear. So they walked all the way to the cemetery where Mandy's ashes were buried, and they said a prayer for her before going back to Mary's to just sit and talk and remember Mandy. And Mary said that this was like a very good thing for her because, one, it helped her, remember her daughter, helped other people remember her daughter, but it also showed her that despite there being a lot of ugliness in this world and horrible things, there was still some love and beauty as well. Now, back to the investigation. Police were able to put together the route that Mandy had taken that day. Like, obviously, her mom's like, I know what route she took, but you weren't actually there, so you can't know for sure that she did take that route. So they were able to piece together the route that she took based on the eyewitnesses from people who had actually seen her out on that run that day, and they were able to tell where she was at what particular time. They determined that Mandy had started her run from her mother's home, obviously, which was on a dead-end road that was about a mile from the highway. And then she ran west towards Strand Street. And Strand Street was a 2-lane long road with like fields and trees and what looked like farming land on either side of the road. The area where she had ran was pretty remote. Like, there were houses, but not very many. And each of the houses were on like giant plots of land, like acres and acres between neighbors. So they were pretty sparse, pretty spread out, but people were there, right? And this area is actually like super duper beautiful. I looked it up. like photos on a map, you know, and it's a gorgeous area. But the point is that it's very remote. She ran to the river, then she started to run back. And that's what they were able to determine. And they were able to determine that she had at least made it to the river and started to head back because her brother Lee, remember, saw her when he was at his friend's house, saw her run and then start heading back. And also a man in a pickup truck had seen her running towards her house. And she was only about a quarter mile away from her own home when this person saw her. They also came to the determination that Mandy had to have been abducted by somebody who had a vehicle because Mandy was just like far too fast on her feet for anybody to catch her. She was like a very fast runner. They also determined that whoever did this must have had some sort of weapon to subdue her and get her into their vehicle, which is probably true. But then I think of cases like Mickey Shunick. If you've seen my video on that, Mickey Shunick was riding her bike when she was hit, like the person hit her with their vehicle and then abducted her. So when I think of things like this, I'm like, what you're saying is most likely true, but like anything could possibly happen. But that's what they had determined, that there was probably a weapon used. She was forced into a vehicle, and they figured that whoever did this was either local or the luckiest son of a bitch in the world. Police were even able to determine the spot that they believe Mandy had been abducted from. So basically, they brought in a tracker, and this tracker followed all of the clues that one would follow in order to determine where somebody had been. I don't know anything about this science, but basically they followed all the tracks from her and from Kyra, and they were able to find a spot where her track stopped and Kyra's tracks just completely stopped. They were able to see in that area, like in the shoulder, on the shoulder of the road, there was like some disturbed grass. It looked like perhaps a scuffle had taken place, which, you know, lines up. Their track stopped. All of a sudden there looks like there was a scuffle between one or two people, and there was a river with river silt like right there. And you remember that Kyra, her butt was all covered in river silt. So they were like, okay, this is most likely where she was taken from. They believe that this dick kicked the dog into a ditch so that they could abduct Mandy, which is really, I was thinking about this. This is such a bold move, right? To abduct a girl in broad daylight who has a German Shepherd with her. That is a ballsy move. But they think that, you know, this person kicked the dog went into a ditch, and that's why the dog came back wet, terrified, shaken up, losing its mind. And they even wanted to try to take the dog to see if the dog could lead them to, you know, anything before the tracker came. I don't know. They wanted to see if the dog could lead them to where she'd been taken, but Kyra was so freaked out that she was of no use for investigators. They believe that whoever abducted her took her miles away from the area where she was abducted, and that's where they attacked her and sexually assaulted her. They believe that she was actually able to escape at one point because when her body was recovered, she had cut marks. She had scratches and cuts on her arms, her legs, and on her buttocks. And they believe this was from when she was running away from her abductor. And this area had a lot of blackberry bushes, and apparently blackberry bushes, which I did not know until this case, have like big thorns. And they believe that these thorns were what was cutting into her as she ran from the person who had been attacking her. It was believed that she was chased down and she was caught, and then she was struck in the top of her head, and that's why she had the blunt force trauma to her head. They think that this likely knocked her out, and then her captor placed her in the river where she either sank and drowned or they held her there until she was dead. Which is just so fucking dark, man. And as far as I can tell, they never did find the crime scene, and they never did find the area where she was placed in the water. She was just, you know, in the water, and she had floated for a while, so they weren't able to find the place where she had been put in the water. And then she got caught on that debris, and that's why they were able to find her in that shallow water where she was recovered. Now, as I mentioned, just like in passing earlier in this video, Ron Peterson, the guy who was leading the search for Mandy, he had recently taken a class like on DNA collection with the FBI. So when they found Mandy's body, he knew that the way that they recovered her, the way that they got her out of the water, and the way that they recovered the DNA was very important. They needed to do everything in their power to preserve anything they had left. He said his biggest fear was disturbing any DNA that was on her body when they took her out of the water, because really they were going to have a hell of a time retrieving anything, if anything was even still there, because she had spent days in the water. Anyways, he used his training. They got her out of the water, and they were able to retrieve DNA from her body. And it was a very specific type of male DNA that was found on her. I'm sure you can put two and two together, and that's part of what helps them realize, before obviously doing an examination, the dark things that had happened to her prior to her being killed. From there, they needed to figure out who had done this. So they were like, okay, who is fucking weird? Who is somebody who sticks out in this community that people would have bad feelings about? It has to be somebody who, like, this person has to have some other sort of weird tendency if they're going to go on to do something like this. Tips definitely came in. People were like, oh, I can tell you who's weird. I got some weird people up in this bitch so we can talk about. And they definitely had a list of, I think definitely a lot. They had a list of men that they wanted to look at that maybe possibly could have a reason. Maybe not so much of a reason, but they were like, we got to start somewhere. So they had a list. One of the first people they wanted to look into, or at least one of the people on their short list in the beginning, well, they had a long list in the beginning. Let me backtrack. One of the people they looked at in the beginning was actually one of the last people who saw her alive. This was, I believe, a man named Paul. And it's the guy in the pickup truck who saw Mandy when she was running by. And I think they looked at him for a couple of reasons. One, he lived close by and she was abducted from near her home. He had told police that he had seen a vehicle with tinted windows, I believe it was near Mandy at the time, but he was pretty vague about his description. And they kind of felt like it was possible that he was inserting himself into the investigation. And this is something that some killers do sometimes. So anyways, those reasons made police look harder at him. So they start looking into him. They actually ask him for a DNA sample and he says no. So they had to actually get a court order. They get his DNA and it turns out he's not a match. They also looked into another man. This was I was going to say a local drifter, but that's not a thing. I don't think you can be local and a drifter. I think drifter by default would mean that you are not local. So they looked into a drifter because they're like, drifter, of course, it can't be somebody who's from our community. We're too good, too close. So they look into him because, he's an outsider. He could be a weirdo. We don't know. But they look into him, they test his DNA, and he too was excluded. Police were also trying to locate a man who had been seen in the area when Mandy disappeared. They were able to put together a composite sketch of this man who was said to have been white, 30 to 35 years old, with a pudgy face and cheeks, dark hair, a mustache, and some stubble. And this sketch was distributed amongst people everywhere, all over the place, but it actually never really went anywhere. I don't know who this guy was. And then later when we find out who actually did this, he didn't really fit this description. So I'm not really sure who this guy was, but they put this out and it was in the newspapers and it didn't come to anything. So that's another dead end. Obviously, police wanted to look into Mandy's boyfriend at the time because how often is it the boyfriend, husband, partner? All the time. So they look into him. And he said that he actually understood. Rick was like, listen, I get why you're looking into me. I'm actually glad that you are because it means that you're doing the most and all the things that you should be doing because I want you to catch my girlfriend's killer. And police looked into him. They said he was super helpful. He was super forthcoming. He was very open even about things that weren't great in their relationship, like the fact that they had broken up several times. But he too was looked into. His DNA was tested and he was not matched. So again, another dead end. This case was dead end after dead end after dead end. Police looked into every possible lead where this case was concerned, and they received new leads every day. They followed hundreds of leads. They had made a DNA profile. Obviously, they they didn't make it. They had it. They fabricated this DNA profile. No, they didn't. They didn't do that. They had their DNA profile, and they ended up taking DNA from 30 different dudes. Okay, and they tested all of them against the DNA profile they had. And each time they were like, is this going to be him? Is this going to be him? And then it wasn't. And they were getting their hopes up and getting so ready to get it solved. They wanted to solve this case. It was so hard to have an unsolved murder in this small community. They were so tight knit. Everyone knew everybody. All of these officers, a lot of these officers that were working the case looked at Mandy and saw their own daughter. You know what I mean? They had a lot of personal investment in getting this solved, not just professional investment. So with each person that they tested and it came back that it wasn't them, they were just losing hope that they were going to solve this case. And with each exclusion of a suspect, they were just like, who the fuck is this guy, dude? Direct quote. Now, you may be hearing this case and be thinking, a young girl found in a river in Washington in the 80s. I don't know why I'm doing that. But you might be hearing that and thinking, that sounds familiar. That might be because you're thinking of Gary Ridgway. Now, if you're not familiar with Gary Ridgway was an American serial killer who killed a lot of women in the 80s. He did most of his work, he killed most of his victims in Washington and Oregon. Oregon was a little bit, but it was mostly in Washington. And what he would generally do is pick up vulnerable women, oftentimes sex workers. He would strangle them. He would assault them. And then he would put their bodies in rivers. And he was known as the Green River Killer. Now, it was speculated that Mandy might have been a victim of the Green River Killer because she did fit his profile, sort of, right? She was a young white woman who was killed and found in water, and he did kill young women and put them in water in Washington in the 80s. So it makes total sense that they would put those two and two, sometimes make 4, sometimes they don't make 4. It always makes 4, but it didn't in this situation. So basically, once they had gone through all of their leads, they actually reached out to the Green River Task Force. They're like, hey, this is what we have. They gave them everything they had on Mandy, like their whole file. And they're like, look at this and please tell me if she is one of yours. Because they were desperate. And the Green River Task Force looked at it and they're like, I'm sorry, but no, like she doesn't fit his profile. She wasn't killed by him. So now they were back to square one. And with this, not with this, but this in conjunction with all of the other leads that they had followed and had not gotten any resolution with, the case went cold, and it would stay cold for 2 decades. But that is not to say that nothing happened during that time. Over the years, Mandy's friends and family did everything they could to ensure that leads were still coming in and that her case wasn't forgotten. Crime Stoppers got involved, and they actually donated some money towards a reward fund that was set up for, give us information that leads to an arrest. We're going to give you this money. We've heard it. We've seen it. It happens. There was actually several funds set up for, a reward fund. There were also like fundraisers done just to raise money to help Mandy's family during this time. There was a lot of things going on that involved finance. Sure. And Mary did everything she could to keep her daughter's name, her case, in the public eye. She did not want people forgetting about her daughter. She would do interviews and she would just say, listen, I'm trying to tell my story as much as I possibly can so somebody out there can see me, can hear this story, and hopefully come forward and help me figure out who murdered my daughter. But still, nothing came of it. 25 years went by and they still had no promising suspects, but they had to keep moving forward, keep being persistent, just keep going. They said that Mandy was dead, but that her case would not die. Like, I cannot stress just how affected people were by her murder. Even decades later, quote, tough, hardened cops were shedding tears about this case. They'd get choked up just talking about Mandy, which is kind of incredible and honestly speaks to the impact she had over this small community. Mandy's mother was destroyed. People would tell her that she was so strong, that she was such a strong person for going through what she went through and keeping her head up. But she said that you cannot be strong through something like this because it rips you to pieces. And she said that she truly did not believe that her daughter's case would ever be solved. She said that officers told her that they'd do everything they could to make sure that they brought the person who did this to justice. But she said with every day that went by, every year that went by, she just continued to lose hope. And she truly did not believe she would ever know who had killed her daughter. But they did try. Police were trying. Detective Kevin Bowie ended up being assigned to the case. He was the 3rd detective to take over Mandy's case. And Detective Kevin Bowie is one of the people that I talked about in the beginning who went to the same high school as Mandy. Not the same year. He was a little bit older than her, but the same high school. He was a young deputy at the time that Mandy was murdered. Like, he wasn't like a detective and working on the case. He was a young deputy. But by 2009, he had been the person who was appointed to take over the case. And he said that he had never forgotten Mandy. He tore through the case file, looking at all the evidence they had, who had been questioned, what they had said. He even went as far as tracking down a previous person that investigators had spoke with that he had like a feeling about. And this person had moved to Cambodia. And this cop, Kevin Bowie, went to Cambodia to question this guy again. But it too was a dead end. Now, running out of options, Officer Kevin decided he wanted to do a DNA sweep. So basically, he had his officers go door to door to everyone, essentially, and ask them for a DNA sample. They had lists of hundreds of people that they wanted to get DNA samples from. So those officers would go, knock on the door, ask the people. They would send batches of DNA samples to the lab and get them all tested to see if any of these people were a match. So he got the idea to do this based on a book called The Blooding, and this book was based on a case out of England where a DNA sweep was used to solve the murders of 15-year-old Linda Mann and 15-year-old Dawn Ashworth. Now, these murders happened 3 years apart and about a mile away from each other, and when Linda was killed, it went unsolved. But then, when Dawn was killed years later, a man actually confessed. But he only confessed to Dawn's murder, not Linda's, and police were convinced that the same killer had killed both girls. So when they tested the DNA, they found, like the DNA on both of these girls, they found that it was true. The same person had killed both girls, and it was not the guy who confessed. Now, why did he confess? I don't fucking know, dude, but they tested his DNA and he didn't do it. So they did a DNA sweep and they got DNA samples from thousands of men in nearby villages. And long story short, they got their guy. It was some dickhead named Colin Pitchfork. Anyways, this is where he got his idea. So they go door to door. They ask people for the samples. A lot of people gave it willingly. There, of course, were several people that were like, nah, dog, I'm not giving you shit. Because, there are a lot of people who are very protective over their, information, their biological samples. And there are a lot of people who are just not super keen on the government and the police. Anyway, now you're going to be shocked to hear this, but the DNA sweep, it was unsuccessful. So time marched on again. And then it was June of 2013 and they got their first real lead, their first actual, legit suspect. So here's what happened. There were these two local girls. Well, I guess women by this point, but they were girls at the time. Like when Mandy disappeared, they were girls who lived in the area. Obviously, local girls. Get it together, Brittany. So these girls by now are two moms. They're two moms hanging out at a water park. When they get to talking, they're chatting to each other. And Mandy comes up because this is one of the biggest things that's ever happened in their area. So of course it's going to come up. And one of the girls is like, listen, I'm fairly certain I know who killed Mandy Stavik. And the other girl was like, yo, same. So these girls were Heather and Merrily. These women were Heather and Merrily. So they're just sitting there on the grass watching their kids play, having this conversation, and they decide that they both have an idea who killed Mandy. So they're like, 1, 2, 3, go. Let's say it on 3. Say who we think it was. That's not really what they did, but they both did say who they thought it was. And they realized in that moment that both of them, over all these years, had an idea who did it. And both of them were thinking of the same guy. They both thought that the same guy was responsible, but they had never said anything to anyone. They had never said anything to police. Merrily has come out and said that the reason she never said anything to anyone, never said anything to police, is because she wasn't sure. And it was like a small town and she didn't feel comfortable or safe accusing somebody of potentially being involved with an 18-year-old girl's murder when you had no proof and just like a gut feeling. But now with her and Heather sitting together and both of them saying the same name, they were like, oh shit, like this might be something that we should tell somebody. Now, why did they think that this guy could be responsible? Why did they think this guy was a suspect? Well, it turns out that both of these women had had some pretty creepy run-ins with him around the time that Mandy was killed. So first, we'll talk about Heather. It was summer of 1989, a couple of months before Mandy was killed. And Heather was 15 and this guy was 20. And they had been at like a baseball game or a softball game. And after the game was done, I believe they won. So they wanted to go to Dairy Queen to like celebrate, as people do. So they all piled in this car together and they're driving over. And in this vehicle with Heather sitting beside her was this guy, this 20-year-old guy who was 20 then, but isn't 20 now. But anyway, they're sitting next to each other. She said he was sitting beside her and he was telling her how beautiful she was, how beautiful her eyes were. And then he like grabbed a pen out of like the cup holder next to him and started rubbing it around her kneecaps because she was wearing like cut off sweatpants. And it's just something about the interaction made her super uncomfortable. Something about the nothing behind his eyes made her skin crawl. And keep in mind, he's 20 and she's 15. So either way, this is fucked up. So that's weird, right? In isolation, it might not be so weird. It's definitely something that like is not inappropriate, but it's not super weird. But then we get to Merrily, and her situation was a little scarier. It's June of 1991. So this is like a year and a half after Mandy was killed. And she was a mother by this point, and she's at home with her son at night when she hears a knock on the door. She opened it, and she found this guy that they're suspecting standing on her doorstep, and he asks if he can use her phone. He says that he's been out hunting all day and he wants to call his wife so that she won't worry. So can I please come inside and use your phone? And she's like, sure. She lets him come in. He starts using her phone, but she quickly realizes that he's pretending to use her phone. while he's got the phone to his ear, making a call, she can hear the dial tone and she can hear the I'm sorry, but your call is not connected or whatever. You remember, right? You remember house phones, right? I feel like most of the people that watch my videos remember this time and remember that sound very distinctly in their heads. But anyway, this is what she's hearing while he's pretending to call his wife. She hears this. She knows he's not really on the phone. He puts the phone down and then just starts walking through her house. Okay? He walks towards her bedroom and he's saying weird shit like how he used to always drive by her house and how he'd look in her windows and how he had always been in love with her, and then tells her, I would very much like to bang you right here, right now. Direct quote. It's not a direct quote, but that's what's happening while she's alone in this house with her son. She was not down with this sickness and kindly told him to fuck off. But he was like, no, I don't think I'm going to. I think I'm going to stay. And it was at this point that she got terrified and she freaked out. And she told him, I'm going to call the cops if you don't get out of here right now. And at this point, he decided to vacate the premises. He doesn't want police involved. He's got something to hide. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe, probably, yes, he does. So now these ladies, they're adults. They've moved on with their lives, but they have these memories in their head. And now they're speaking to somebody else who also had a weird experience with this person. And it validates what they had been feeling, there's safety in numbers. So they realize we need to tell someone. So Merrily actually contacts a cop that she knows, another guy. All of these people went to Mandy's high school, by the way. Remember how I said so many? Merrily, Heather, the guy that we're talking about, this cop, his name was Ken Gates. She calls him and she's like, hey, I think I know who might have killed Mandy. When she tells the officer the name of the person that they think is responsible for killing Mandy, they realize that this person, during the time that Mandy went missing in the 80s, he lived right in the same neighborhood as Mandy. He actually lived on the street that she took her running route. He lived right on that street, but he had never been looked at by police. He was never a suspect. He had never even really been questioned about this because he was super well liked in the community. His family was well liked in the community. He went right under the radar. Nobody thought he was weird at all. But now he was on police's radar and he was their prime suspect. And this was a man named Timothy Forrest Bass. So now Tim is on police's radar for the first time. And remember, it's been decades by this point. So he has moved on with his life in a big way. He is married. He has 3 kids. He's moved to a nearby community of Everson. He has a job. He works for a bakery. He goes and delivers those baked goods. He drives the truck, delivers them baked goods. And he's living a very quiet and unassuming life. He doesn't have any record and he seems to just be kind of keeping to himself and doing his own thing. When police looked into who Tim was at the time Mandy was murdered, they found that it doesn't seem like Tim and Mandy even knew each other. It's possible they crossed paths, but they definitely weren't friends. They had gone to the same high school, but they had gone during different years. And apparently Mandy did know Tim's brother. That's why I'm saying it's possible that they crossed paths because Mandy and Tim's brother were closer in age. They had the same mutual friends. So they were, acquainted. But Mandy and Tim weren't friends, and Tim wasn't part of the same group of friends that his brother was part of. He was just, Tim was Mandy's friend's brother, right? Did I say that right? Tim is the bad guy. Okay, Tim's brother Tom was friends with Mandy. They were in the same friend group, but Tim wasn't in that friend group. Tim was just Tom's weird, loner, awkward brother. That's what I was trying to say, and I hope that I got it out because it is very early, and I haven't slept very much. But moving on. Now, besides the connection between Mandy and Tim's brother, the only other connection they were able to find between Mandy and Tim at all is that Tim often attended basketball games where Mandy was playing. Because remember, she played a zillion sports. If you watch the first video, her extracurricular activity list was long as hell. She did a lot. So she would play basketball. Tim would show up at these basketball games. And in hindsight to people who were there, it seemed like he watched her a bit too much, watched her specifically. And the only other connection was that Mandy would jog by his house all the time before she went off to college because this was a run that she did all the time. So he had definitely seen her, knew her routine, knew what she was doing, etc, etc. Now, let's go back to Tim around the time that Mandy was killed. I mean, we're kind of already there because we're talking about the basketball game and the running and stuff, but now we're solidly there. We're talking about past Tim. Tim married young. He got married at the age of 22 to a girl named Gina. And he actually married this girl just 6 weeks after Mandy was killed. Apparently, Gina and Tim met while she was working at her grandfather's, I believe it was like a general store. And Tim came in to get a hunting license, because apparently that's where you get hunting licenses, is a general store. So he comes in to get his license. He starts talking to her and he asks her out. And she's like, oh, it felt really nice to, be recognized and be, seen as an option for somebody. So she accepted. But she said the relationship moved super duper fast. Like, the two met and they had plans to get married super quick after dating. But they were planning to wait till after Gina graduated high school before they got married. But then after Mandy was killed, apparently he went to her. He rushed to her and he's like, hey, how about we move this up? How about we do it now? And she thought it was weird, but she wasn't really connecting it with the Mandy situation at the time. So she's like, sure. They got married. Okay. And then ended up moving out of the area almost immediately after. Mandy was killed on the 24th of November. And by January of the following year, they had already left the area. Now, though the two got together, young, the relationship moved fast, they got married, they moved away. It doesn't really seem like they married for love, at least not on Gina's part. I don't know about him, probably not, because he's a dick. But for her, she said that she mostly married him because she just kind of wanted to get away from her family. She wanted to move away from the town that she lived in. She wanted to be out on her own. So she's like, marrying this guy would be the way to do that. It's the 80s, 90, let's do it. But it seems that this was a bad call because he was not a good husband. Once they got married, he was super, super controlling, emotionally abusive. He would dictate who she could and could not talk to, what she could and could not do, where she could and could not go. He would even choose the colors she was allowed to wear. She said through the marriage, she felt like his servant. He would make her do everything for him and she'd have to do it without saying anything. He wouldn't let her talk. He would tell her to shut up. He would call her a bitch. He would call her a whore. She said that it didn't feel like a marriage. It felt like a prison, but she stuck it out because they had 3 kids together, for one, and 2, she was scared. She said that she was scared of him throughout the time that they were married, that he wasn't often physically abusive, that when they would get into fights, he would come at her with a balled fist, but he didn't often hit her, but he had slammed her into the wall on a couple of occasions. She had tried to leave him once during their marriage. She left him for 2 months, and she actually did get a restraining order. And during this time, she said that she was scared. She was scared for her. She was scared for her children. She said that he was physically and mentally abusive to both her and their kids. And another thing that she said, which was it seems random, but in the context of what we're talking about, it's not random. She said that he was kind of a true crime aficionado, which same. He watched a lot of true crime shows, and he would often watch cold case TV shows where people would get caught after so many years. And he would say that these people were so stupid, the killers were so dumb, and that if he was the one who was killing somebody, he would never get caught. Which I often say that killers are dumb, but I'm certain that if I killed somebody, I'd get caught, and I also wouldn't, and I wouldn't say it. Now, during this time of their separation, where she got the restraining order and all that, she actually did try to file for divorce. She was like, I'm gonna get out of this. But he threatened her, not with violence. He told her that if she tried to get a divorce, he would do everything in his power to get the kids taken away from her. He's like, I will lie to the judge. I will do whatever it takes to make sure you never see our kids again. And she said because of this, because of her fear of losing her kids, because she believed that he would be a vindictive asshole like that, she did come back. And I feel like some people might be like, oh, she's the ex-wife, she's angry, so after the fact she's saying things like this, because I see comments like that. Sometimes people are weird. But a lot of what she said, or some of what she said rather, was corroborated by Tim's own brother, Tom. He said that he would see how Tim would speak to Gina, and he didn't fucking like it. Now, speaking of Tim's brother, police go and speak to him. His name is Tom, by the way. I think I mentioned that. Tim and Tom. And they go to speak to him. And luckily, he is willing to talk to police because they want to try to find out, as much information they can about Tim, who he was growing up, who he was now, all that jazz. And Tom's like, sure, yes, I will talk to you. I guess the relationship between Tim and Tom had been good at some point. When they were younger, they were close, little brothers and older brothers often are. I don't know. I'm not a brother. I do not have a brother, but I hear that they can be close. They spent a lot of time together when they were younger. They would, play outside. They were super competitive with each other in things like sports. They would play games. He said that his brother seemed relatively normal for a lot of his younger years. He was definitely a loner, but as he got older, towards high school and things like that, he definitely had a sort of shift in the way that he was. He said that as a teenager, social interactions just didn't really come easy to Tim. And he would just do some weird shit. Like, okay, he said that in high school, Tim had this girlfriend and that she had broken up with him. And that Tim and this girlfriend were on the phone. And he was telling her, like, I'm going to kill myself, which is dramatic and a bit of a red flag, right? But it does happen. But what doesn't happen, and what happened here, is that all of a sudden, Tom, who's in the house, hears a gunshot ring out and realizes that Tim is like telling this girl, I'm going to kill myself, I'm going to kill myself, and then fires a gun off like into the ceiling of the house so that she will think that he's done it. That is unhinged behavior. So that was one of the weird things that Tim did when he was younger. And apparently as he got older, he just got weirder and weirder. His brother said that he could see that his brother did not respect women. He could even see that his brother was disgusted by women. He said he got the impression that Tim felt that he was superior to women as a man. And that meant that if a woman denied him, somebody who was below him denied him, it would send him into a complete tailspin. And this is the guy we're talking about here. Now, back to the investigation. So once police learn that Timothy Forrest Bass is a creep supreme, they're like, okay, we need to look into this guy. So what do they do first? Obviously, step one, go and talk to Tim. So they do. They're like, let's go question him. And when they get there, they decide to kind of take a friendly approach in the beginning. They don't want to hardball him right from like the start. So they go and they're like, hey, we're just interviewing people from the past and we're talking to people about, the murder of Mandy Stavik. And he kind of like looks up at the ceiling. He's like, Mandy, pretend like he doesn't know who she is. Oh, isn't that girl they found in the river? Now this stood out to police because he's trying to seem casual, like he doesn't remember, but this is a weird way to go about it. This is a strange thing because everyone knew about Mandy's murder. Everyone remembered Mandy, right? Like this wasn't something that you're just going to casually forget. Even his wife, Gina, remembered Mandy. She's like, I didn't know her, but I would see her running around. And I definitely remember that she was brutally murdered in our small town because that didn't happen. But then Tim's over here like, I don't know who that is. So police hear this and they're like, I don't know about you, guy. And they're like, hey, would you be so kind as to give us a DNA sample? Because they definitely at this point are feeling like he did it. They already kind of felt like he did it. And now he's pretending he doesn't know Mandy. And they're like, that's weird as hell. So they're like, can we have some of your saliva, please? And he was like, actually, that's going to be a no from me, dog. Because here's the thing. I don't want you to have my DNA. And also I watch all those crime shows and I know how easy it is for somebody to get like arrested once they give their DNA, etc, etc. And I'm like, yeah, especially when you're the one who did it. So police leave and Gina is kind of like, why wouldn't you just give them your DNA? I can only imagine how freaked out she was by this. She's like, why wouldn't you just give them your DNA? Like, let them have it and test it and just be done with this. Like, we could be done. That's it. They'll never show up again. And he was like, no, because here's the thing. They could frame me. People get framed all the time, dude. Like, that's what they'd be doing with people's DNA. Which, I mean, but not in this case. And she, at this point, was kind of like, who am I living with? Now, police want his DNA, right? They need his DNA, quite frankly. But he's like, no, I'm not going to be giving that to you. So they're like, shit, we got to get creative here. So they're like, what if we were to go to his work and try to get the DNA there? Because presumably he's just spraying DNA all over the place because we're just leaving DNA at every turn. I don't know how anyone thinks they're getting away with murders anymore because DNA do be everywhere. So they contact his work and they are like, hey, we would like some DNA, please. And they're kind of vague about it. They don't say really what they want, what it's for. I don't even think they said who's specifically they wanted. There was just talk of like swapping a work truck. And the girl, I believe this was Kim, she was like, listen, this is above my pay grade. So I'm going to have to say like, no, you're going to need a search warrant, which is, they're right. And they were like, shit, we don't have that. So we're at back to square one and a dead end again. Dead end, dead end, dead end. That's what this whole case is about. But they would get a break. They decide that they're going to go back to the bakery because what they want is to get Tim's work truck route, right? So that they could follow him and see if he discarded anything anywhere that could contain his DNA, right? They're doing like the Golden State Killer thing. They're like, okay, let's see. Maybe he has a soda pop. Maybe he touches some stuff with his hands that are all sweaty and gross, whatever. So they go in and they're like, hey, we wanted to see if we could get the driver of one of your drivers. And this is when Kim, the manager, I believe, is like, can you just come to my office real quick? And they're like, sure. So she goes back there with them. And they're like, so what's up? And she's like, question. Yes, what? That's what they said. That's not what they said. Anyway, she's like, I have a question for you. And they're like, okay, what? And she's like, are you investigating Mandy Stavik's murder? And they were like, yeah. And she was like, are you looking into Tim Bass? And at that moment, because at this time, nobody knows they're looking into him. So they hear this. She's unprompted. She's bringing up Tim. And I'm sure internally they're just like something's up if she's saying his name and we're looking into him. There's got to be a reason she would think that. So they tell her like, yes. Okay, yes, we are looking into him. And she decides at this point, oh, this is within my pay grade. And she decides to help. She gives them the route. She doesn't know exactly why they're following him, like for the DNA specifically or whatever. But she knows that they want it. She knows that they're looking into him for that. And she's like, sure, yes, here's his route. Now, why was she all of a sudden like willing to help one before? She's like, that is above my pay grade. Well, it turns out after the police had come into the bakery asking for the DNA and getting rejected, Kim had been out with some like work acquaintances at a bar, I believe. Doesn't matter where they were. I think it was a bar though. They were hanging out and they were just like shooting the shit, talking shit about their other coworkers. You know, if you know, you know. I mean, I don't have any coworkers anymore, but back when we had coworkers, back when I worked at the law firm, everybody was talking shit about everybody. So they're out, they're kind of talking shit. And the subject of Tim comes up and they talk about how he's such a weirdo, how he's such a creep. And then somebody mentions like, oh, and did you know that like he lived on the street that Mandy Stavik lived on when she was killed? Da, da, da. And it's at this moment that a light bulb went off in Kim's head. And she was like, oh, shit. I wonder if when police came, they were coming because they wanted Tim's DNA in connection with Mandy's murder. Da, da, da. So her head starts spinning. And that's when she realizes like, oh, I bet that's what they were looking into. So when they come back, wanting like the work truck route, she was like, I need help because this is clearly what they're investigating. So a surveillance team was put on Tim and they followed him all night while he drove his bakery route. They were watching him like a hawk, like, okay, let's see. What's he doing? What's he doing? Is he going to throw anything away? Any DNA? A la Golden State Killer. But alas, no, he never did. He wore gloves the whole time he was, it's like he knew, but he didn't know. He probably was just a glove wearer, but it just seemed, I'm sure they were like, fuck, man, because he wore gloves when he was stocking the shelves. He didn't smoke. He didn't drink anything. He didn't throw anything away. So they were stumped. They couldn't do anything. It's at this point that police actually go back to Kim and they let her know like, hey, the tailing was unsuccessful. And this is when she asks them just straight up like, listen, do you want DNA? And they were like, actually, that's exactly what we want. And she was like, I got you. And she told him like, I knew that you would want DNA because I watch those CSI shows. This is what I do. So I know what you want. And they were like, we can't like legally ask you to retrieve his DNA because that would be, you know, it's just not, what is it? Privacy. I don't know. There's like a law. They can't ask her to get the DNA. And she's like, well, you're not asking me. I'm telling you that I would be happy to do it. So don't you worry. I'm going to get it. And I'm just going to give it to you. And I just picture this whole conversation with like the police being like, Kim, would you like to form an alliance? And her being like, absolutely, I do. Just like in The Office with Jim and Dwight, remember? If you don't know, you don't know. But either way, she was invested and it was rocking and it was rolling. I mean, she was local, right? She was 19 when Mandy was murdered. And like everybody else, she had been affected by her murder. It had been the first time in her life that she wasn't feeling safe in her home. She said it changed everyone's perspective in their little corner of the world. And she said that she was a mom now. And if anything happened to her kid, like she'd want to know what happened. And she couldn't imagine how Mandy's mom was feeling all of these years later, having no idea what happened to her daughter. So she was like, listen, you're not asking me to help, but I am going to do what I can to help. Now, Kim said that she knew that Tim was weird. Like she didn't think he was a murderer, but she knew he was weird. He was the type of guy who, when you worked with him, you didn't know which version of Tim you were going to get that day. He was the type of guy who would get irrationally angry over small things. Like his reaction to situations were unjustified, unwarranted, right? They were just like a bit too much for the situation. That makes sense, yes. She said she also knew that he didn't respect women because even though she was his boss, he didn't call her by her name. He called her woman, which is so disrespectful and frustrating. And she said that she was just kind of like, and would shrug it off. But in hindsight, it's like, oh, call me woman because he doesn't respect me even a little bit. She said that ever since the police had shown up, she couldn't get it out of her mind that somebody she knew might have been the person responsible for what happened to Mandy. And she said that, like, in her gut, she felt like it was him, but in her heart, she felt like it wasn't. She had a hard time grappling with the fact that somebody that she knew, somebody that everyone knew could have done this, and that they had been betrayed by somebody that close to them all of these years. Like, that would be very hard to like be like, wow, you really just don't know anybody. How do you trust anybody? So from that day on, she tried to get his DNA. She would follow him all over the place to see if he would like set something down or throw something out that might have his saliva on it. She was like being a little detective. She would clean out the trash can so that if he did throw something in the trash, his trash would be the only trash there. So she could be like, aha, I got it. But day after day, he spurred her advances. He thwarted her plans. But then 3 months after having that conversation with police, it happened. It took her by surprise. No, but it did happen. He threw away a plastic water cup that he had filled up from the water cooler, and he threw away a Coke can. And as soon as she saw them in there, she was like, oh shit, it's go time. The time is nice. She said her heart was like beating out of her chest, but like there were people around. So she had to be all stealth about it, but she was able to like quickly grab the cup and the Coke can. She threw it in her desk drawer. She sealed them up, signed, sealed, delivered them to police. Now, after getting those samples, it took another 3 months for them to get the results back from the lab. But when they did, the lab tech, I believe her name was Katie, she called police. And I believe it was Ken Bowie, I think his last name was, who took the call. And she just says, listen, we have a match. And the officer was like, holy shit. He said it didn't feel like a real time. It felt surreal. It felt like a dream. He's like, this is a dream I could wake up from at any time, because after all these years, they finally had a match to the DNA of the person who killed Mandy. And it just like blew their mind, because it was definitely him. Like, it was a 1 in 11 quadrillion match. And I was like, quadrillion what? Like, that's 15 zeros. And the officer, when he heard this news, he just started to cry. So police head back to talk to Tim, and they actually catch him as he's leaving work. And they're like, hey, we have a question for you. And he's like, what? What now? And they're like, so you never knew Mandy? No. You never met her? No. You didn't have a relationship with her? You didn't kiss her? No. And police are like, this is great. This is perfect, because now he can't try to explain the DNA later, right? By saying like, oh, I knew her. Oh, we had a consensual relationship. No, you're saying right now you never knew her. So they're like, okay, you didn't know her? Have a relationship with her? Then why was your DNA inside her body, bro? And this is when he responds with something that's weird. Not like, I would never, not, oh my God, like I didn't do it. He said, how'd you get my DNA? What are you talking about? But his goose was effectively cooked. And now on December 12th, 2017, 28 years after Mandy's murder, he was arrested and he was charged with kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. And that same day, police went over to inform Mandy's mother that the murderer of her daughter had finally been caught after all of these years. And she was in shock. She did not believe that she would ever, I'm getting all goose skinned. She did not believe that she would ever hear those words. She never believed that she would ever find out what happened to Mandy. And now she was learning this on her 81st birthday. See? No. Detectives also called Kim, the manager, that helped them get the DNA. And they told her, like, listen, it was a match. We got him. It was a match. And she was very emotional. She asked her, one of her first questions was like, does the family know? And they were like, yeah. And she said, like, that's why she did it, that she did it for Mandy's mother, because she never forgot Mandy. Now, if you're curious, Mandy's mom, Mary, and Kim did meet. They hugged, and Kim told her, like, I did this for you. She said, like, she had been called a hero, but she doesn't feel like it was her. She felt like it was a collaborative effort. She did say that she was like proud of what she did, but that's just who she is. She does the right thing. She said that she feels like it was Mandy's soul that guided her towards getting justice. And she said she's just happy that now Mandy can be set free with them getting a guilty verdict. She said that, like, even though she didn't know Mandy, she kind of felt like she did. And she said that all of Mandy's family and friends that she met have just been like completely wonderful to her. And that kind of made her feel even sadder that Mandy's never going to come back. And that this guy got to live 30 years basically as a free man, because he was 50 by the time he was arrested, which, I mean, he still has, presumably several years left to rot in prison, but he got so many years as a free guy, got to get married, got to have his kids. It's just not fair. But, Kim said that she did what she could. And that, it wasn't an easy decision for her, though. She said she definitely had her reservations and that she had fears in helping. She was afraid of helping the cops, basically. She said that after Tim's arrest, she was worried about how people might react when they found out she was the one that helped turn him in. She wasn't sure if she would lose her job, and she was worried about her safety, so she took steps to protect herself. Apparently, the bakery even hired an armed guard at the store for 3 weeks after Tim's arrest, just in case. And, I'm not really sure who she thought would be rocking and rolling in there, but she did what she had to do to keep herself safe. So Tim was arrested, as I said, and he was denying it and denying it. He was not, admitting to anything. He said, "You're trying to get me to admit to something that I did not do here." He tried to act like he had no idea why they would have him there. And he was trying to figure out if they really had his DNA. Because, again, he watched crime shows, so he knows that police can legally lie to you. They can say they have something they don't. So he's trying to figure out if they're just lying to him or if they really have his DNA. But once they realize that they do, in fact, have his DNA, he changes up the story a little bit. He tried to Shyamalan twist the officers by saying, "Okay, listen, I lied when I said I didn't know Mandy. I did know her. I knew her well. We were even intimate with each other. And that's why my DNA is there. And I just lied and told you that I didn't know her and that I hadn't slept with her because I don't trust police and I don't trust the government and I didn't want to be honest with you." He said that he had met Mandy one day while she was out on a jog and that he had met her with his father. Put a pin in that and remember that for later because it's got, actually remember it now. Basically, by the time he was arrested, his father was dead. So the only person who had ever, seen that he knew Mandy, had any record, any person who ever once had seen them, that's a good sentence. The only person who could be like, yes, he knew Mandy, was now dead. But we will come back to his dad a little bit later because this Tim guy's a dick. This Tim guy is a dick. He said that the two had met the spring before she left for school. And he said that when they first met, their relationship really was just as friends. And most of the time it was just friends. They confided in each other. They talked about, their hopes and their dreams and just they had that sort of friendship relationship. He said that it wasn't even that sexual once it did move past the friendship stage. They mostly would kiss and cuddle, but occasionally it would go farther. So he tells police this, he tells defense attorney this, and he tells his wife this, because remember, he was with her at this time, so he tells her that he cheated on her, and she promptly divorces him, which good for her. But she didn't divorce him that quick, so not super good for her. So when Tim was being interviewed, Gina came in, his wife, and she was interviewed too, and she actually gave Tim an alibi. She said that the day Mandy went missing, she was on her way to Tim's house because she always went to see him after school. And she said on the way, she actually saw Mandy. She saw Mandy run right past her. So she then said that her and Tim were together the whole rest of the afternoon. So he couldn't have done anything to hurt Mandy because she had seen Mandy alive and well, and then he was with her the whole time after. Now, she did come back later to police and tell them that the alibi she gave him was a lie. She said that he told her that she needed to lie for him or he was going to go to prison. And so she did it. She felt like she had to do anything she said. And she said that she felt like if she didn't lie for him, she could be next, which I don't know. I don't know how I feel about this whole situation. Because, she did say she was abused. It's sticky. It's one of those sticky things. But the facts are that she lied for him and then she came back and she told the truth. And she said that at that point, she was a weak person. She was a weak person when she was with him, but since then she has gotten stronger and she wishes she had just gone with her gut from the beginning. So, I don't know. You let me know what you think about that whole situation. I'm kind of I go back and forth because I'm it's fucked up to lie and give somebody an alibi for murder, but also abused women, abused people have been broken down over so much time that I don't know how I feel. I wasn't there. I wasn't in her head. So, move on. Back to Tim. Tim tells police the Shyamalan twist that he had been sleeping with Mandy. But here's the thing. He knew nothing about Mandy. He said that they were friends who confided in each other, who talked to each other. That was the basis of their relationship, but yet he knew nothing about her. He didn't know what she was taking in school. He didn't know what her hopes were, what her dreams were, what she wanted to do with her life after school. Didn't know anything about that. He said he didn't even know that she was home for the break, the school break, because they never called each other or wrote any letters because there's no, trail that they knew each other. He said that she just showed up at his house that day, one of these days during that break, for a booty call. That was it. It sounds like bullshit, right? And her family agreed. When they heard that he was saying this, they were appalled. And her sister said that the idea of them being together was actually laughable to her. And she said specifically of this quote, "There's no way my sister would have had a physical relationship with Tim Bass. She was way, way, way out of his league, to put it bluntly. So the prosecutor on this case was a man named Dave. And Dave had been in his 40s at the time that Mandy was murdered. So at this point, he's like in his 70s, right? Because it's been like 30 years. And he had actually retired by this point. But when he found out there was an arrest and there was going to be a trial for Mandy's murder, he was like, put me back in, coach. I'm going to be the one who puts this monster away. And not only did he come out of retirement to try this case, right, and to be the prosecutor on this case, he did it pro bono. He didn't want any money for this. He just wanted to put this guy in jail. Tim pleads not guilty, and the trial begins. And every day of the trial, the courtroom was full. They reached capacity every single day. All the people who loved and knew Mandy were there. There was so much media there. The media filled up 2 rows, and they even had to hire extra security just for this trial. The prosecution's case was clear. They said Mandy had been kidnapped, raped, and murdered, and Tim's DNA was inside her body when she was found floating naked in the river. The defense, they had their work cut out for them with this case, but they went in with as much confidence as they could. And his defense attorney said, quote, Tim Bass is not guilty. He didn't kidnap anyone. He didn't rape anyone. And he certainly didn't kill anyone. Tim's attorney did try to have the DNA evidence suppressed, saying that the DNA evidence violated his client's Fourth Amendment rights to unreasonable search and seizure, saying that Kim was essentially acting as an agent of the state instead of coming to police in good faith herself as like a volunteer. And he said specifically in this quote, put simply, law enforcement officers cannot use private citizens to obtain evidence without a search warrant, where a search warrant would otherwise be required. Which I think this is a really interesting point, to be honest, because even if you don't agree with it morally and you're like, fuck this guy, because for me, I'm like, fuck this guy, I do believe that Tim Bass did this. At the same time, if the DNA was retrieved in a way where a person is supposed to have a reasonable expectation of privacy, right? And the cops use like a loophole to get the DNA. I think this is a good argument, is basically my point, because like cops shouldn't be able to do things like that, right? We have to police the police, you know what I'm saying? But at the same time, I'm like, damn. But the judge was like, nah, dog, the DNA's staying in regardless. But I thought it was a good argument. Sometimes the defense attorneys, I'm like, wow, you're really just throwing whatever at the wall to see what sticks. But this one, I was like, you're doing your job. So when this didn't work, his attorney was like, okay, fine. And he told the court that Tim and Mandy had a consensual sexual relationship. He said that Tim, and Mandy had sex the day she was murdered, hours before she was murdered, and said that's why his DNA was in her body, and that DNA in her body can prove that contact happened, but it can't prove that rape happened. It's just wild that they tried to say that he had a consensual sexual relationship with Mandy, especially considering he knew nothing about her, had never made any phone calls with her, never wrote letters to her. No one had ever seen them together. Plus, Tim himself said that he had never had a relationship with her, didn't know her, never knew her, barely even remembered her. His attorney was later asked, like, what could you say to those people who said that there was no proof that this relationship ever happened? No evidence to say this relationship ever happened. And he was like, hey, you know what? I don't have to prove it. The burden of proof is on the state of Washington, not the defense, which is, I mean, technically true, right? The burden of proof is on the prosecution. But I was like, something about the statement just hit my ear wrong. And it made me feel like this guy was a dick, but also like he's not wrong. The defense also had a Dr. Elizabeth Johnson testify at trial, and she was a forensic expert. And she basically testified for the defense, saying that the semen that was found inside Mandy could have been there longer than the prosecution was saying, right? She was saying that the semen could have been in her body for up to 48 hours. But then for the prosecution, the original medical examiner who examined Mandy back in 1989, which was Dr. Gary Goldfogel, I think his name, Dr. Gary. He was like, respectfully, I disagree. There was so many things that showed that this was a newer sample, like closer to 12 hours before she was killed. It was like a much more recent sample, and that all of his findings were consistent with her being raped and then murdered. Tim's ex-wife also testified against him, and she was terrified. She did not want to go to that court. She did not want to see his face, but she did. And she gave police some pretty damning information, or gave the court some damning information. Her testimony was good. It was strong, and it was effective, because she told them how she had lied for Tim, how he had asked her to lie and give him an alibi. And then she told them that he had not only asked her to give him an alibi and to lie for him, but had also asked his own mother. She said she overheard him telling his mother, like, hey, can you do me a favor? Yes, son, what do you need? Can you tell police that Dad, my father, your husband who died 10 years ago now, can you tell police that it was he who killed Mandy? And I guess his mother was shocked and like appalled. She like brought her hands up to her face like, holy shit, like I can't believe you're asking this. And then she simply told him no. Tim's brother Tom also testified at trial, which was incredibly hard for him because, like, you know, he knew and he loved his brother. He said that the night before the trial, he hardly slept, but as horrible as he felt and as guilty as I'm sure he felt, he knew this was something he had to do. Tom said that after Tim had come under suspicion of murder, Tim had come to him and been like, hey, I slept with Mandy back when she was murdered. I was sleeping with her at that time. And I guess he then asked Tom, like, could you do me a favor? Could you tell police that you were also sleeping with her? I think he was doing this, or at least Tom thinks that he was doing this to make it look like Mandy was like a promiscuous girl, to take suspicion off of him and to like prove like, oh, she'd sleep with this guy, then she'd sleep with this guy. Obviously, she was just sleeping around. Tom also said that this was the first time his brother had even told him that he had slept with Mandy. And Tom was like, how did this happen? How did you end up having a relationship with Mandy? This is so random. This came out of nowhere. And he said, Tim said of this quote, oh, I just went up to her and said, oh, you're keeping fit. And that was it. And he said that after this, Tim looked at him and was like, you believe me, right? And he says in that moment, he had no idea what to even say. He also said that after he was arrested, after Tim was arrested, Tim was talking to his family. He was talking to his mom and he was talking to Tom. And he was like, listen, I need a strong alibi or I'm going to go to prison. Like, everyone's against me. They're trying to frame me. They're trying to pin this on me. And then he asked his mom, like, hey, mom, I need you to give me an alibi. I need you to tell police that we were out Christmas shopping together so that they can't say that I killed her. And Tom, I need you to back her up. Like, he was asking everyone to lie for him. And his defense was like, I just thought it was ridiculous. Well, not ridiculous. I don't know what I think. It just stuck out to me. His defense didn't try to say that like, oh, these conversations never happened. They were like, listen, even an innocent person put under extreme stress with fear of going to prison for the rest of their lives for something they didn't do, even an innocent person will start acting in a way that would make them look guilty under this type of stress. And I was like, okay. The defense wrapped up their case by saying that this case was operating under the wrong assumption that there was a sexual assault and there had never been a sexual assault. And the prosecution said this was not a case of consensual sexual contact. She was abducted, she was raped, and she was murdered. So the jury was sent to deliberate, and there was uncertainty in that jury. One juror like stood before the jury table and was like, listen, sometimes teenage girls do sneak out and have relationships that nobody know about. How do we know she wasn't sleeping with this guy? And like a quarter of the jurors were unsure too. Like, there was a lot of doubt there, but they went over each piece of evidence, you know, tacking it up on the board and stringing the red string from piece to piece, trying to like, I don't think they literally did that, but figuratively, they were really trying to see what they believed happened here. Outside, everybody was so nervous. They were nervously sitting there waiting, just praying, hoping with all that they had that they would come back with a guilty verdict, because they realized that they all had to agree. Every juror had to agree. If even one juror wasn't sure and didn't agree with the rest, it would be a hung jury and they'd have to go through this all over again. And Mandy's mother was just like praying, like, I cannot do this again. Like, I cannot go through this again, and just hoping that they would come back with a verdict soon. And then after a day of deliberations, about a day of deliberations, the jury came back with a verdict. They had found Timothy Forrest Bath guilty of all charges, guilty of kidnapping, guilty of rape, and guilty of murder. During the sentencing hearing, Mandy's mother, Mary, and her sister, Molly, were too emotional to speak. So Molly's husband, Mike, actually spoke on behalf of the family. And now that I've said that out loud, I'm realizing how many M's are in this case. Mandy, Mary, Molly, Mike, Merrily, the girl from the water park. It's a lot of M's. Anyways, Mike said to the court on behalf of the family, quote, Timothy Forrest Bass must never be allowed to walk the earth as a free person. Never, ever. Tim's mother did testify. She did come and testify on his behalf. I believe this was at the sentencing phase. I can't be sure now that I'm thinking back. My brain is a scrambled egg. But she said that her son was totally innocent, and any claims from Tim's ex-wife or her own son, Tom, that Tim had asked her to lie for him or to say that her husband was responsible was totally false. And then she said specifically, quote, "He was found guilty in people's minds way before the trial even started and is being sent to prison on people's emotions, not any real evidence. The prosecution wants to solve this case, even if they convict an innocent person." Tim also addressed the court for the first time ever during his sentencing hearing. During his trial, he never did take the stand. So this was the first time anyone was going to hear him, say something for himself. Speak up. Like, what's up, bro? Like, what's going on? And he said at this time, quote, "I would first like to say that I am 100% innocent of this crime. Furthermore, I don't believe I received a fair trial. In saying that, though, the better man in me says I should say very little today and give this day to the Stavik family." Ultimately, the judge ended up giving Tim Bass the maximum sentence he could under law. This was 27 years, and he was sentenced to this in 2019. And it was 2017. What? And it was 27 years, my brain, instead of life, because though he was found guilty of murder, it wasn't premeditated murder. They weren't going after premeditated murder, which honestly, I feel like is the right call in this case. Sometimes I'm like, this is clearly premeditated. Sometimes it's like, that's a really gray area. And I think that if they had tried to go after premeditated murder, they might not have gotten a guilty plea, especially when we look at like how wishy-washy the jury was and how they weren't sure. When you're putting somebody either for life or to death, right? When you're not sure, you're going to be more likely to, you know what I mean? You know what I'm saying? We could have had another Casey Anthony situation because I think their mistake there was going after premeditated murder. Even though emotionally I'm like, well, Casey Anthony. Logically, I'm like, we can't prove that it was premeditated. So they, but anyway. The judge said to Timothy, quote, "For 30 years, you have lived free from the responsibility for your acts, but that life has been a lie. And tragically, it had caught your family, your mother, your brother, your ex-wife, and your children in its web." He was then handcuffed and then led out to go and serve his 27 years in jail. And I watched the footage of this, and this is the moment, like this is the first moment during the entire trial that I saw something in his eyes, and it looked like, well, not that I saw anything in his eyes, but it was at this moment that he looked terrified. He was like, oh, fuck, like this is real life. I am going to jail. I am guilty. Now, Tim did try to appeal his conviction, of course, you know how they do be doing. He was questioning the search and seizure of his DNA, the sufficiency of the evidence used against him, the ineffective counsel. He also tried to challenge the fact that Mandy's diary was suppressed, saying that it showed evidence that she was suicidal, so maybe she had killed herself and wasn't murdered, which is like so fucking stupid. Yeah, I'm sure she freaking hit her own head, got naked, and then drowned herself in the river. Like, that makes a lot of sense. Anyway, the appeal was filed in 2021, but the appeals court was like, fuck you, no, that's stupid. You are in jail. Direct quote. Which is good, right? I think it's good because across the board, it seems like most people believe that he did it. His ex-wife absolutely believes he did it. And even his brother seems to believe that he did it. His brother has said he wonders if Tim planned to kill anybody else, because it's so hard to believe in a case like this that somebody would just do it once, right? That's what blows my mind. Like when I think back to the Sophie Sergey case, if you've seen my video on that, that's what blew my mind, is to do something so violent once. It's so crazy. And his brother has said he wonders if he even planned to kill Heather or Marilee back in the day. And most importantly, like, Mandy's family believes that he did it. Mandy's mother has said that she is satisfied with the amount of time he was given, the 27 years, because even if he does get out one day, by the time he gets out, his life will basically be over. But not literally, right? Basically his life would be over, but not literally. Mandy's life is literally over. She is literally dead forever, and her family will never get to see her again. And it just seems incredibly unfair because he got so much free life. You know what I mean? But, you know, they remember her, and there are a lot of ways that people remember her. Like, for example, her college at the time that she was killed, like a bunch of the kids at the college went out and bought a tree and they planted it in her memory. And there were like hundreds of people there to like honor her at that time. And trees live for like ever, right? They're around forever as long as somebody doesn't cut them down. So that's a way that people can remember her for like years to come. In addition to that, a scholarship was set up in Mandy's name at Mount Baker High School, the high school that everyone in this case went to. And it would be awarded to a student who I believe took part in the music program. Yeah, I checked my notes. And basically it's for students that have taken an active part in Mount Baker High School's music program, including participation in their senior year. Like, you can't just do it in your freshman year. You have to be doing it in your senior year. And the scholarship will also be awarded based on the applicant's associated student body activity, school and community activity, high school academic record, work experience, and athletic participation. So they want somebody who's doing it all the way Mandy was to get her scholarship. And speaking of the scholarship, something that's really sweet. You remember Mandy's song, the song that was performed at her memorial service? Well, this song was written by two of her friends, Pete and Annie. And they actually went on to record this song, and they put it on, I believe, cassette tapes, because 80s and 90s. And the tapes were stocked in Fred Meyer stores, in the surrounding areas. And they were sold for $3. And all the proceeds, or at least part of the proceeds, I think it was all, the proceeds from these sales went into this scholarship fund, which I just thought was very sweet. Now, as far as Mandy's family, her mother did end up selling her home on Strand Road, and she moved an hour away to this place called Oak Harbor. I have to imagine it would be very hard to stay in a place like that, to stay in a home and in a town that's plagued with so many horrible memories. Even though you have all the good memories, you also have all that bad energy and all those bad memories. So I can imagine it would be hard to stay there. But she also had a good reason to leave. Oh my God, it's getting me. She moved so that she could move in with her other daughter, Molly, and meet her new grandbaby, a girl who was named after Mandy. And with that, my friends, is the story of the murder of Mandy Stavik. I hope it was informative and made sense, and I gave you every bit of information you would want when looking into this case. And of course, I just want to thank you for remembering Mandy with me today. And now, considering I gave you all the information, I now want to revisit the question of the day, and that was this. How do you feel about the way that the DNA was collected in this case? I want to know what you think about the method that they went to do it. Do you think he was right when he said they shouldn't have been able to do it? Do you think that they should be able to do things like this because DNA is DNA? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below, because I feel like this could be a divisive topic. Anyways, guys, before you leave, please don't forget to leave me a comment down below with what case you'd like to see me cover in the future. As you may or may not know, I have a long list of cases, and anytime you leave me a suggestion for a case, I put it on my list. I put your name next to it, so if I cover it, I can give you a shout out. I love looking into the cases that you guys recommend, because they're often cases that I haven't heard of or need more coverage. And I know I'm tired, and I know you're filled with good ideas and good taste, otherwise you would not be here. If you haven't already, please feel free to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new video every single week, and I'd love to hang out with you. Yes, you, specifically you. And if you want to hang out more consistently, all my social media is listed down below, along with a link to my membership where you get early access to non-sponsored videos, priority comment responses, things like that. And now I just want to say one last thank you to Dossier for partnering with me on today's video. It's sponsors like Dossier that make it possible for me to put out videos as consistently as I do. And of course, I want to say a big thank you to you guys for always being so supportive of all my sponsors. You rock. Don't ever change. And now with all of that said, I just want to thank you for being here when you could literally be anywhere else in the world. That is tight. You are tight. Please stay safe and be a better person than you were yesterday. And I hope to see you in my next video.